All right. Great. Well, here we are. So we'll just officially kick it off because I have shared it out several different places, and I think people will join when they can. And the great thing about videos like this is we can always download it and people can watch later. So it's kind of evergreen with that, so, which is wonderful. So it is a wonderful evening here. We're doing a Q&A this evening with Rebecca Huls, who is a therapist who is has done a lot of work with and certifications with EMDR. I am Betsy Peelan. I serve as the president of Hope for HIE. This is a part of our Q&A series that we are doing with Hope Goes Live. And we're trying to bring topics that are really important to our families and community. So we can talk about different things with different providers and subject matter experts that are beneficial to our community. So I want to thank you, Rebecca, for joining us this evening. And if you want to kind of tell us a little bit about you and your practice and all of that.
Sure. I am a licensed professional counselor in the state of Georgia. I have a master's degree in mental health and psychological therapies. My undergrad was in psychology, and I got my license about 3 years ago now. I have 3 kids. I have a 6-year-old. I have 2-year-old twins. My husband's a band director, so life is busy. I work for a practice called Atento Counseling. It used to be ThriveWorks, which is kind of ThriveWorks locations all over the country, but we recently moved away from the franchise and now we are just our own entity. So we have 3 different locations. And I am pretty general in my scope with clients I see. I see youngest is around 6 or 7. There's no kind of top age limit. But I do now find myself leaning more towards the trauma field. So different ages, but a lot of the clients I see have a PTSD diagnosed or undiagnosed symptoms. So I utilize EMDR quite frequently with clients. And even the clients I don't utilize the processing stages of EMDR, I will do a lot of the resourcing with them. And just developing good coping skills and good bodily awareness as well. So yeah, it's a little bit about me.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that background. And we know each other from, so full disclosure, we know each other from back in the day when you are still involved in Color Guard and I was involved in Color Guard in that community at one point. And we've kept in touch through Facebook, which is such a wonderful platform to connect. And so, you know, I have myself gone through EMDR, and it has been such a game changer in my life after going through my son's birth in 2012, getting diagnosed with PTSD, and going through that trauma of a NICU journey with a lot of unknowns and a lot of other things going on at the time. And so obviously in our community, our parents and caregivers are extremely prone to, they pretty much everyone that has this experience with their child, I mean, it is trauma. You are in a traumatic situation, life or death. You don't know what's going to happen with your child. Our babies are born typically very ill, and it's touch and go for, you know, no matter what outcome comes through. Primarily, it's very, very intense. So, you know, that is one of the, you know, parent mental health is huge in general. And then for our families dealing with that trauma, you know, obviously everyone has different coping skills and everyone's brain works differently. But we always, you know, when we always talk about how, and a lot of the literature says that trauma permanently changes the brain. So when we're talking like, you know, our kids are going through brain injuries, and then we're not even thinking about how that trauma is affecting that's literally neurologically changing our brains, right? So one of the biggest things that, you know, we encourage parents in our community is seeking out support in a multitude of ways. And a lot of our families obviously go and seek out mental health support from counselors and therapists. And all of that, and, you know, figuring out what will work for them for what they have gone through and how they can, you know, find it manageable. And a lot of our families have chronic trauma as well, where their kids are very medically complex and they might go through several bouts of ups and downs and things like that. So if you can talk a little bit about like what EMDR is and why, you know, like you talked a little bit about, you know, the type of practices that you do in your field, but what, you know, why, give us a little bit about what EMDR is.
Sure, yeah. So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is a really long word, lots of words. So we use EMDR just to make it easier, but essentially it was discovered by an amazing woman called Francine Shapiro. And she, strangely enough, found that one time she was walking through the woods. I think she was walking her dogs. This was like back in the 60s, 70s, I could be wrong. And she found that she was, I don't remember what it was, but she was thinking about something that was quite upsetting for her. And as she was walking through the woods, she was looking at the trees, and she was kind of looking back and forth at the trees. And she noticed that at the end of the walk, she didn't feel quite so activated at the memory that she had been kind of thinking about when she was walking. And after a lot of other research, we've since come to find out that, well, we've come to find out a lot of things, but the reason why that worked for her in that moment is because our brain wants to move towards health when it comes to processing memories. So when we are in the deepest part of our sleep, we refer to that as REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep. Our eyes move back and forth during that part of our sleep cycle because we're processing information and our brain is working really, really hard. That's why we only stay in that REM sleep portion of our cycle for a very short period of time. I think it's only about 10, 15 minutes or so. But when both sides of our brain are working at the same time, just a byproduct of that is that our eyes flicker back and forth. We would call that bilateral stimulation. So both sides of the brain are being activated. And that is what we've come to find is almost like a really kind of fertilized landscape for processing. That is the optimum situation for our brain to be in order to be able to process well. So knowing that, it made a lot more sense that when Francine was artificially creating that bilateral stimulation, moving her eyes back and forth, it placed her in a kind of prime situation to be able to process information. Since then, I mean, that was a very kind of rudimentary experience for her, but since then it has been refined greatly, and there's a lot of research that has taken place, and there's still so much more research ongoing now as to the very mechanics of how it works, because a lot of it is still unknown. We know that trauma does impact the brain, you know, at a physical level. You can see it. But with the invention of fMRI, we're able to really see in real time how protocols such as EMDR are able to impact the brain in a positive way. So EMDR is a 8-phase process. It's not linear. You can move back and forth through the processes, but it's an 8-stage process. And anybody who is looking to utilize EMDR should be expecting to be shown through an 8-stage process. I would always encourage people to shy away from clinicians or practitioners who say, hey, let's just try this thing, and there's no prep, and it's like, let's just give it a go. Because it does take a lot of resourcing, and we can talk more about that and what that is. But yeah, essentially what we know about EMDR is, what we know about trauma is that when we experience something really traumatic, we don't process that information like we process other information. It's so overwhelming on the brain. It's so much at one time, and that can be one specific moment. It can be, as you mentioned, like prolonged trauma, but it's so much on the brain, and so we don't process it like we process regular information. We hold it in our limbic system, mostly, but like in our amygdala as well. And it doesn't get filed away like other information does. And we know that because if something occurs that even reminds you vaguely of that event, it's like you're right back there in that moment. We would refer to it as it lights up your limbic system. You are right back there. That's when we see clients refer to, flashbacks, terms like flashbacks, or they find themselves responding in the same way with that fight or flight response to something that isn't dangerous. And they recognize that the present trigger isn't dangerous, but their body doesn't recognize that. Their body's responding as if they were right back there in that moment before. So of course, with children, who've had really kind of medically fragile and have had, real touch and go situations coming into the world and moving forward, something as simple as a fever, that you might be able to logically think, okay, this doesn't necessarily mean something terrible. Your body doesn't respond that way. Your body responds like you're right back in those earlier moments. So, yes, EMDR helps you to take that information in a very systematic way and move it from the limbic system into the prefrontal cortex. And in fMRI, research that's utilized fMRI, there has been you see an increased blood flow. During that time, you see increased kind of interaction between those two areas of the brain, which there's still a lot more research to be done, but which indicates that there is definitely some kind of transference of information or activity going on in those different areas. So yeah, that's kind of an outline of what it is.
That's really helpful and very technical, and so good to, in our community, we're research nuts, so we're trying to learn as much as we can about the brain. So this is so wonderful to be able to think about how our brains are processing as well. And so, when you talk about those things that kind of trigger and take you back to those flashbacks and everything, those can be from different senses as well. We were talking about that a little bit earlier, where, a lot of our, I myself and a lot of other people, it's like even smelling a certain cleaner, like, I was at a conference at a hospital, and I was fine being in the hospital. It wasn't even the hospital that, Max was born in. And I've been back there several times and it's been fine. But for some reason I was walking out of the building and this cart with all the cleaner was on it, and it just wafted. And I just felt like I was going to pass out, like it was, and have a panic attack. It was really, really scary because I felt like I was fine. And, so that was really surprising to experience that it can be a multi-sensory.
Absolutely. And we see that, across the board. We see it a lot in children. So, I can tell you a little bit more about the specific type of EMDR that I'm trained in, which is somatic and attachment focused EMDR. So it really works with that attachment piece, that much of our interpretation of trauma actually comes from our earlier childhood experiences as well. But we, with EMDR, any good EMDR clinician will, of course, help you address the trauma in particular, but should also look to see if there was any earlier times when you felt similar ways. Because the likelihood is that your response to that event could well have happened before in different situations. And I'll explain a bit more about that, but we always try and go for the earliest childhood memories as well. And in doing that, many early childhood memories aren't visual. They are sensory. They're stored in the muscles. They're stored in the senses, because we don't even have the words necessarily to describe how we felt at that time, when we were younger, but we can say, I felt this way, or, I remember feeling the way this person's hand felt on me, or whatever. It's a sensory memory. And the other part with that too, a lot of people I've met and spoken to have said, well, I don't really know if this thing happened or not, or if it happened in this way that I feel like it did, and I don't want to generate false memories. There's concerns about that with the EMDR. In the methodology that I have worked in, the accuracy of the memory doesn't matter. It's the way it makes you feel in the present moment. It doesn't even matter if the memory is real or not. If you feel a certain way in the present moment, then it's real for you.
Mm-hmm.
We could kind of negate all day long, well, did it really happen that way? Did it not? It doesn't matter. Your body thinks it did, and so your body's reacting that way. And so the way that you recall an event doesn't have to be factually accurate. But if you recall something, it makes you feel a certain way, then we would address the way it makes you feel and desensitize the way it makes you feel. We don't really get caught up in the details of what that memory is, and the accuracy of it.
Very interesting. So what is, when you talk about that EMDR is using rapid eye movement, so tell us a little bit about what, I mean, you don't, do not try this at home, but you want to do this with a licensed professional. But what is kind of the basics of, what a session what are the nuts and bolts of that someone
So as I mentioned, it's an 8-phase process. So no clinician should, on your first or second session, start processing with you. And that's really, again, it's not dangerous by any means. You can do bilateral stimulation yourself. Going for a run is bilateral stimulation. Going for a walk, anytime you're using both sides of your body, that is bilateral stimulation. But it's important, we know that when we've experienced trauma, that's extremely painful, and we learn really good ways to stay out of that pain. So whether that be avoidance, or maybe it's I'm a very standoffish person, or maybe I'm a overly caring person, because that's how I've learned I've had to be in order to feel okay. We know that when we are going to talk about painful memories, all of those ways of being are going to come into the room. All of those ways of being are going to come up, and that's okay. We just want to know that that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. So, and this is, something that's quite specific to the type of EMDR I'm trained in, but the first stage is history taking. So we just want to know about you. We want to get to know you. We want to know just a snippet of what the trauma is, nothing more than a sentence or two, but really more so, how have you managed up until now? What are the things that you do to keep yourself feeling okay? Those are really important things to know. The second stage is resourcing, and this is extremely important. So we often talk in therapy about the window of tolerance. The window of tolerance is the amount of discomfort you can manage without going outside your window of tolerance. And on the top end of your window of tolerance is panic attacks, right? Mm-hmm. And the bottom end of your window of tolerance would be numbing out, dissociating, checking out. Your window of tolerance is like a cushion, and it constantly changes. So as we all know, when you have a newborn, you lose sleep, you're exhausted, your window of tolerance is like this already. If you've been on a week's vacation and life is great, your window of tolerance is a little bigger. The amount of distress that you can manage without feeling completely overwhelmed is bigger. We want to grow your window of tolerance so that you can manage the distress that's going to come up when we talk about previous traumas. But we don't want you outside your window of tolerance. No, EMDR is not useful when you're outside your window of tolerance, because you're not processing anymore here and here. You're just surviving. When you're having a panic attack, you're not processing. When you're dissociating, you're not processing. So we want you inside that window of tolerance, but we want you on the fringes, right? We want you to be able to feel that discomfort, but also know that you are safe right now, that you are okay right now, and that same fight or flight response that has been there doesn't need to be there anymore, because you're safe right now. That thing isn't happening right now. Now, of course, there are always exceptions to that when we talk about prolonged trauma and recurring traumas. But essentially trying to keep you within that window of tolerance so that you can recall that experience, you can acknowledge that it was awful, but you're not outside your window of tolerance every time you think about it. So resourcing is very much about that. It's also coping skills, whatever you want to call it, but we really focus on the body. So, noticing what your body feels like when you think about certain distressing events. I even have clients, I have like a box of kind of gadgets and beanie babies and things like that. And I will have clients pick two and just tell me which one they like better. And tell me what in their body tells them they like that thing better. And just notice him. Okay, well, I feel a little bit calmer when I hold this one. I don't feel so tense in my jaw when I hold this one, or this one kind of makes me feel like a little uncomfortable. Noticing those messages going back and forth, because 99% of the messages that come back and forth from our body to our brain, we don't even acknowledge them. Especially when we've experienced trauma, because we function at such a high level of anxiety most of the time that we don't notice many other messages other than be anxious, be anxious, be anxious, right? Everything else just kind of goes by the wayside. So resourcing is essentially helping you manage and stay within your window of tolerance while also managing a certain amount of discomfort. That period of time can vary greatly. It can be 2 sessions, it can be 12 sessions. It just depends on what the individual skill set already is, what the window of tolerance already looks like, and allowing people to feel comfortable sitting with a certain amount of discomfort. The third phase is establishing targets. So then we want to talk about, okay, what are the memories that you want to address? And in my scope of EMDR, we don't just say, tell me every crappy thing that ever happened to you. It's very specific. So we kind of talk about what is the challenge that's showing up for you right now in your life, and what is difficult for you to do. Maybe it's difficult for me to feel calm in certain situations, or then we talk about, well, what is how disturbing is that sensation to you on a 0 to 10 scale? What is that emotion like? Where do you feel it? And can you recall any earlier times when you felt that way? In the form of EMDR I'm trained in, so which is somatic and attachment focus, we will even say, okay, when you bring up that memory, what is the negative belief you have about yourself now? Because trauma is a part of everyone's life, but no two people experience a trauma the same way. So you and I could be in a car accident. You could get out and get in another car and drive home and be fine, and I might never be able to get in a car again. And what that really comes down to is that moment in time meant something to us, or we internalize that in a way, whether it's I'm helpless, I'm not good enough, it taps into something deeper. And so we want to get to that part, because that's really the root of why that trauma is so intense in that moment. And we can each recall things that have happened to us that were really crappy. But the interesting thing is that it's not always those moments that trigger us in the same way as other moments do. And in your, like you said, in your experience with Max, I'm sure there were many, many, many horrifying moments. But for you, something about the smell in that moment, it did it. More so than maybe other things that you might assume would be more triggering. So yes, we always want to tap into what was it about that moment that connected so deeply to you, and how you felt about yourself. And then we kind of go deeper and we say, do you recall earlier times when you felt that way, and earlier times, until we get to the earliest memory that you have of feeling that way. We would call that your touchstone memory. Generally it's in childhood, but not always. And let me preface this by saying we don't have to do this. We can do restricted protocol with just the one memory you want to work on. So if you just want to work on one specific thing, we can do that too. But, if someone's had complex trauma, or just a really kind of prolonged pattern of responding in the same way, that's when we try to kind of go deeper to those earlier memories. Then stage 4 is the actual processing. So we utilize bilateral stimulation in many different ways. So it was originally researched using eye movement, which when a clinician will sit kind of to the side of you, in front of you, and they'll normally hold their fingers like this, and they'll kind of do 20 to 30 passes back and forth at a pace that's quick, but it shouldn't be like distressing to you. That's one form of bilateral stimulation. They may also utilize tapping. So they may kind of tap back and forth on your knees if you feel comfortable. I use little pulsers. So I have like a little box that connects to these little pulsers, and my clients will hold them and they buzz back and forth. My clients tend to like that because they're not always comfortable with being up in their face, and this aches after a while going back and forth. So that works.
It is a personal thing when you're, I mean, you know, my therapist used this. And so, yeah, you're in it. So
yeah. And some people like that, and that's fine. Right. And some people much prefer just kind of curl up on the couch with a blanket and have the buzzers, and that's fine too. There's also audio bilateral stimulation. So you can have headphones on that just kind of beat back and forth. The modality does not, in the research that's been done so far, does not seem to decrease the effectiveness. It's just really what the individual feels most comfortable with. But all forms of bilateral stimulation are simply just kind of putting the coal in the engine. If you imagine a train, we're putting the coal in the engine, we're getting the brain ready to process. And it's very systematic. So again, we're not just asking you to dive into a horrible memory and swim around in it. We're going to ask you, how distressing is it for you on 0 to 10 scale? And then we'll do 20 to 30 passes of whatever kind of bilateral stimulation and ask you what you notice. And we want you to be able to notice how you're feeling in that moment, but also have an awareness that you're in the room right now, that you're not just asking you to go back to that moment and just mill around in how terrible it was. That dual awareness is what we call it. So being aware of what's going on in that memory, but also being aware of what's going on in the present moment. That is what facilitates that movement of information into the prefrontal cortex. And so pretty quickly, you start to become a little more desensitized to it. So your clinician should check in with you every so often. Okay, when you go back to that memory, how distressing is that memory to you? With 0 being neutral or no disturbance, 10 being the worst disturbance imaginable. You tell them where it's at. Okay, let's go with that. Go back to, doing some more. Eventually, again, this might happen over the course of one session. It could take several sessions. There's really no time limit on it. You should be able to get that memory down to a 0 or a neutral sensation in which you can think of it, you can acknowledge it, but you don't have that, right, that lighting up of your limbic system in the same way. That's the desensitization piece. Initially, EMDR was just called EMD because it stopped at the desensitization piece. What we came to learn, though, is that, well, okay, they're desensitized from it, but can we actually reprocess a new and more appropriate cognition to associate with that moment, and more of a positive cognition about yourself in that moment or the environment in that moment? And so the R was added on the end, and the R is the 5th phase. So that is when we then establish, well, what is a more appropriate cognition for that memory? So if the memory before was, I felt useless, or I'm helpless, right? A more positive cognition was, I did everything I could, or it wasn't my fault. Something more appropriate, something more positive. And then we kind of do the opposite of what we did in the 4th phase. So we then say, okay, how true does that feel to you right now on a 1 to 7 scale, where 1 is completely false, 7 is completely true? Don't ask me why it's 0 to 10 and then it's 1 to 7. I don't know. But then you might say, okay, well, it feels like that's like a 2. Okay, so just hold that memory together and those words, it wasn't my fault, and just see what you notice. And we just go back, do some more. And eventually that positive cognition will start to literally, be combined with that memory. So when you kind of use that colloquial term, but those neurons that fire together, wire together, it truly occurs. So you're able to associate that memory, that moment in time, with a more positive cognition. So then that will get you through the reprocessing phase. From there, the 6th stage is a body scan. So we want to just do a quick scan of the body, make sure that you're not holding on to any kind of tension, tightness, unusual sensations. EMDR is exhausting because we're asking your brain to do a lot of work, and we can feel tense afterwards. So we want to just make sure that you feel neutral, you feel relaxed, you feel calm. For us, the 7th stage is, just kind of going back and looking at evaluating that experience. What is something you've learned for yourself or about yourself through that experience? And then the 8th stage is reevaluation. So now going back and looking and saying, okay, do the other memories you had in line still hold a charge for you? It's not unusual when you process one memory for other memories in line to not hold the same charge anymore, because our brain does so much work and all of our memories are so connected that it's not typical that we just process that one memory. Even if we just target that one memory, other things come up, and our brain does the work. It's kind of like gives it that kickstart it needs to then start processing and clearing out other little things and moments in time that were distressing to us that might not be as distressing anymore. So yes, that's the 8th stage process. So that's why it's very important that you meet with someone who is well trained in EMDR or preferably certified, just because it's a next level of it's a 10-month process to do certification. Well, for some, it just depends. It's another 20 hours of supervision. I did it over 10 months. I don't think that has to be the case, but it definitely helps really inform a clinician and help them become more attuned to a client's needs. But yeah, that's a whole lot of information, I know.
That's great. No, I mean, that is so thorough and so important, I think, because I had mentioned before, it's, being a parent is difficult, enough. And then when you add, a traumatic start to it, it's like, it can just totally morph, and you're worried, you're always putting your child's needs ahead of your own. And, that whole trite, like, put on your oxygen mask before you put on someone else's, we don't do, right? So,
right.
But at some point, and, I think we try, especially like, the people that head up our peer-to-peer support, we really try to remind people that you you deserve to feel good, right? You deserve to, like, it's so important, and it's hard work, but on the other side of it is like, I mean, for people everyone that has done it, that posts, about their experience, has been so positive and saying, like, I mean, I've said this, like, I felt like I got my life back. Like, I was having visceral reactions all the time, and I was like, I can't keep doing this. I'm not the mom I want to be for my kid, because this is happening. It's interfering with all the things I want to feel, and, like, it doesn't feel good. It's negatively impacting every single facet of my life. So, and really, taking that time and that investment in yourself really can pay dividends, as you move forward. And then if you're faced with other traumatic things, like, because life happens, right? Like, at least, in my personal experience, when I had a traumatic experience happen, when I lost my mom about a year ago, and I was in the midst of trauma again, I could actually use my tools from going through that and going, I am literally going through trauma right now. So my brain, I felt like there was more resilience because of going through that.
Yeah.
So it's just, it was such a great thing that I think can carry you through so many other, because life is going to throw you additional hard.
Yeah. And it can be relentless. I mean, this isn't just a, hey, one-stop shop, get it done, and then you go skipping into the meadows the rest of your life. Stuff comes up, and that's why a lot of people kind of come in for certain things and they come back years later for other things. And but yes, I feel as though when you've been through the EMDR experience, you have much greater self-awareness, Your window of tolerance is bigger, so you're able to manage a certain amount of discomfort, but you're also able to recognize, okay, this is trauma. This is a lot. I'm not processing this. I'm outside my window of tolerance, and that alone can sometimes help facilitate that transition of information. But yeah, absolutely. And I want to say too, you know, we used to, I say we as in like we as a whole community, you know, as in psychology, used to feel that PTSD was linked to veterans, right? That it was people that were returning from war-torn countries and extended periods of having their life in danger. And what we've come to know in the last, 20, 30 years is that it's so much more than that. Trauma is something that, yes, new parents experience, parents with medically fragile children absolutely experience, NICU parents. There's a podcast I listened to the other day on, trauma for NICU parents. It's absolutely, it extends far greater than veterans. And I think acknowledging that is really important, and also acknowledging that trauma doesn't have to be one major event or several major events. We have big T trauma, which, yes, are the things that we could all identify and say, oh yes, that probably was traumatic. But there's also what we call small T trauma, developmental trauma. It's that drip of things that happen to us that just keep our body in this state of fight or flight. And that's trauma too. It doesn't have to be a big moment in time. And a lot of clients that I meet will say, well, I just feel like I shouldn't be feeling this way because it was only blank, or it happened this many years ago. It doesn't matter. If you're responding in that way and your limbic system is lighting up, then it was traumatic. I've had clients, just the smallest moment in time that even when they've gone back and told their parents about it, or it was something that the parents are like, that really hit you in that way. But yeah, it did for them. And there's no right or wrong with what's traumatic. So if anybody is feeling like, well, mine wasn't as bad as theirs, or this wasn't as bad as that, no, if it lights you up and it makes you feel like it's holding you back, then it's trauma. And we have grown so much in the field now with trauma and understanding how it impacts adults, how it impacts children, how it leads to worsening of mental health, further mental health diagnoses. The ACEs study that was done a couple of years ago on adverse childhood experiences, in helping children process trauma. So it's just a much greater body of knowledge now than we used to have.
Which is great. It's one of those things you talk about the gamut of medical, right? And how we are just, from where we were 20 years ago to where we are now in all sorts of ways. It's amazing to see, I always say it's like a good time to have something bad happen, because, we have access to so much research, so many better resources than we ever had.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. Even in, I was reading an article the other day that was saying that in some areas of Israel, they're actually training paramedics in EMDR to utilize it in the ambulance, like immediately post-trauma, because it's so powerful and it can really help like keep the cogs turning and stop that experience from just kind of, being that big red file on the desk that never gets filed away. So yeah, it's cool. And there's so much more research coming out. It's real time. It's happening in real time as to how effective it is and why it's effective, because some of it is still unknown. But the results suggest it works. So
absolutely. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I don't see any questions coming in. I know we had typically, like when we're on Facebook, we have like our 9,000 followers. So a lot of people can pop in. This is a little different tonight. So our Q&A, like as far as questions from the peanut gallery, are going to be probably nil this evening.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
But we will be sharing this link back out on our Facebook page as well. And So there'll be, there might be some people that have questions, and we
Yeah.
can communicate on answering those and things like that as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions, after the fact, or if people wanted to shoot me an email, you can share my email address. That's absolutely fine. But yeah, I just would encourage people to prioritize themselves, that make it a priority, because truly, we have to be in a good mental place to be able to give to anybody else, especially our children, especially children that, have high needs, and that, we do have to be on guard, that we're not machines, we might be parents, but we're still human beings. So definitely mental health is, to me, more important than getting your nails and hair done. It's like, you have to take care of yourself. And we just don't. It's getting better. It's absolutely getting better. I have a lot of students now, like high school students and college students, and therapy is the cool thing to do. Like, therapy is like, oh, I'm going to therapy, that's like, I'm cool, which is great, because it used to be something that was like,
very stigmatizing,
flipping in the side door where no one can see you, in the darkness. So I love that it's becoming more accepted, and that it's becoming a more, it's a conversation piece. It's just, but I would hope that in NICUs especially, that it's something that can be really advocated for and recommended, because that's a hugely intense experience at a really vulnerable time in your life, when you're physically vulnerable, emotionally vulnerable, and it's very hard to come out of that unscathed.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely something that, when we talk about advocacy and working closer with our clinical partners in the NICU, of, what are those referral patterns of, making sure that people, obviously in the NICU, they're so focused on taking care of baby, and they want parents to succeed, but the resources, it's just a slow process. But that's something that we really highly advocate for, is making sure, we try to provide a peer-to-peer network that people can get information and feel supported in their parenting. But we're parents, so we're not practitioners and clinicians, and so trying to figure out the best ways to hook up our parents with those resources, for sure. So from the get-go, I would say therapy is so helpful, and it's the gift that keeps on giving. As you mentioned, it helps you establish those coping skills in the long term, because parenting's scary. It's tough and scary, absolutely. All right. Well, I want to thank you on behalf of everyone at HIE for taking the time tonight of your schedule and everything, and joining us to share your knowledge and your passion for this. So helpful. And I know our community will be able to go back and, kind of review all of this, which will be so helpful moving forward. So thank you again for joining us tonight.
Of course. You're welcome. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.